Hi, everyone, and welcome back to a Criminally Basic podcast. I'm Megan.
And I'm Hannah.
And this week I decided to kind of go down a little bit of a psychological rabbit hole. Hannah, have you ever heard of the Stanford Prison Experiment by any chance?
Yes, I have. We actually talked about it in my psychology class my sophomore year.
I minored in psychology, and I think the whole concept and the whole field of psychology is so fascinating. But I had learned about it a little bit too in a few of my psych classes. We didn't really spend a lot of time on it, but it was just, mentioned a few times here and there.
I feel like everyone mentions it, but no one explains it.
What I had thought of previously before actually looking into what it was, just the basics of, I think, what most people know. There was a study done at Stanford University about, power dynamics and power structures, specifically within a prison system, but it kind of was meant to make a comment on the kind of power structures at large in any sort of industry, any sort of dynamic. In my research, I found that not only was this, not the super upstanding psychological experiment that we all think it is, it actually really doesn't hold any psychological weight to it at all.
Really now?
Yeah, I was fascinated. So I thought that I would share this story with all of you. It isn't technically true crime, but I feel like it's referenced enough in not only discussions about things going on today, but just in true crime in general. I've heard it mentioned a few times, and so I think it would be beneficial to go into a little bit. So the infamous psychological experiment began on August 14th, 1971. In Palo Alto, California, 9 college-age middle-class students were picked up from their homes by police officers. The 9 were arrested for either armed robbery or burglary, so one of those two charges. They were then brought to the police station and booked before waiting transport. Those 9, as well as over 70 others, responded to an ad in the local newspaper asking for volunteers for a psychological experiment at Stanford University. The ad read as follows, quote, "Male college students needed for psychological study of prison life. $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks beginning August 14th. For further information and application, come to room 248 Jordan Hall, Stanford U." End quote.
That's the thing. If you offer college students money, they're going to take it.
And for 1 to 2 weeks for $15 a day,
especially for the 70s.
Exactly. Good money, good deal. I probably would have signed up for it if I had, met the met the qualifications. So the researchers, according to prisonexp.org, wanted to see what the psychological effects of prison were. Specifically, they wanted to test what happened when seemingly normal people were put in a very specific power dynamic in which there was a very clear boundary between those in charge and those subject to them. They wanted to see what those in power would do when given complete control over depersonalized others under complete anonymity. So the guards in this had complete anonymity. Nobody knew who they were. And the prisoners in here were only given numbers. So they were depersonalized to just a number. They had no name, no other defining features. Ultimately, what this experiment wanted to test was to see if people behaved poorly due to their disposition or if it was the situation that caused them to behave that way. In the basement of Stanford's psychology department building, researchers set up a makeshift prison. The hallway was considered the quote-unquote yard. 3 rooms were converted into cells with 3 beds each, and a hallway closet acted as solitary confinement. I've seen in a few places that the 9 young men who were chosen as the guards actually helped to construct the makeshift prison, but I can't confirm that as I didn't find it to be a consistent fact in my research.
Okay, even if it was true, theoretically speaking, if it was, doesn't that create kind of it messes with the variables of everything?
A little bit. I think that they really wanted the guards to have a sense of ownership over this place. They helped build it, they helped create it. It's their space that these people are coming into, which I can understand to an extent. But like you said, you're kind of adding in more variables there. At one end of the hallway, there was an opening. There, the researchers could videotape and record the events. They were quite literally in the walls, which is creepy, but I
And
mean,
horrifying.
yes, but I mean, they wanted to be as far removed from the situation as possible while still having complete, visuals on everything that was going on. There were no windows or clocks, so the prisoners couldn't tell what time it was. Spoiler alert, this later resulted in some time distorting experiences.
I don't want to know what that is, even though you'll probably tell me, but it's horrifying to think about.
So the 9 prisoners were brought to the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building, and they were stripped, searched, deloused with a spray, and placed in their prison uniform. The uniform consisted of a smock with their prison number, rubber sandals, and a nylon stocking that was placed over their hair. This was to portray their heads being shaved, but since this was only a summer job, Zimbardo, who was the lead doctor on this, didn't want the men to actually have to shave their heads, which, okay, fair. They also had a chain on their foot, although this was uncommon for most prisons at the time and is very uncommon for prisons today. This was to remind the prisoners of the oppressiveness of their environment. The 9 guards also had uniforms which consisted of khaki pants, khaki shirts, and mirrored sunglasses. Zimbardo himself actually took on the role of warden of this prison.
Hold up. Wait a minute. That is some tampering with the experiment right there.
It totally is. This is one of the first instances of Zimbardo possibly accidentally, possibly purposefully sabotaging his own experiment. Everything the prisoners and guards wore had a purpose. The numbers on the prisoners' smocks dehumanized them and turned them into nothing but a number, like we talked about. The mirrored sunglasses made it so that the prisoners couldn't see a portion of the guards' faces, which gave them anonymity. Before the experiment began, the guards were told that they were almost completely free to do whatever they thought was necessary to keep the prisoners in line. The limits included things like physical punishments, especially those that could cause serious harm. The guards were given no specific training on how to be guards as well. Instead, they were free within limits to do whatever they thought was necessary to maintain law and order and to command the respect of the prisoners. They were given a warning, though, that this job could be dangerous, similarly to what a real prison guard would be told. And so, after all of this, the experiment began. The first day was entirely uneventful, and Zimbardo himself even said that he was worried they were going to be there for 2 weeks and not get anything. There were 3 guards per 3-hour shift, and the prisoners mostly just stayed in their cells. The prisoners and guards weren't used to their roles yet, and they weren't really taking things too seriously at this point. However, on the second morning, the prisoners removed their stocking caps, ripped off their numbers, and barricaded themselves inside the cells by putting their beds against the door.
That's crazy. Absolutely crazy.
It is crazy, and the reason for this, to me, is kind of a little unclear. It could have just been, because they were bored, which, fair. They're tired of not doing anything.
Yeah, which makes sense.
Right. But regardless of the reason, the guards, came to do what they were told to do. They came to come and assert their dominance. They called in the rest of the guards who were home since, they worked in 3-hour shifts, and they decided to use force to get the prisoners back under control. The first thing they did was take a fire extinguisher and spray the prisoners away from the door so that they could get in. Next, they stripped the prisoners naked, took the beds out, and forced the ringleaders of the prisoner rebellion into solitary confinement. After that incident, the guards began to harass the prisoners almost constantly. So this is day 2, and things have already disintegrated this much. The guards decided to set up a privilege system after this in order to get the prisoners to comply. They designated each cell as kind of a different level of privilege. Those in the privilege cell got to keep their uniforms and they got their beds back. They were allowed to bathe. They were allowed to brush their teeth, which is just, basic human necessities, but they, viewed that as...
Really never take basic human necessities away from anyone.
No, and that's super illegal in prison systems today, but they decided, clothes aren't a necessity, beds aren't a necessity, this is a privilege, and you have to earn these things. The other prisoners were not given such luxuries and at times were even prohibited from eating, which, again, super illegal in today's modern prison times, and I would hope were illegal back in the 70s, starving a prisoner.
Yeah. This is like so bad.
It is so bad, and it's crazy that, this is day two. This is day two, and it has disintegrated this much. After the rebellion, things just drastically took a turn and took a turn for the worse. The guards moved some of the quote unquote bad prisoners to the privileged cell and some of the good prisoners into the bad cell to make it look like they had a snitch among them. The scales at this point had officially been tipped, and the horrors that we're all aware of kind of began to unfold at this point. The prisoners were forced to do push-ups, they were denied the ability to go to the bathroom, and they were regularly humiliated.
Oh, this is horrible. This is torture. This is cruel and unusual punishment. I don't like it.
Which is why, just 36 hours after the experiment began, prisoner number 8612 was released. According to prisonexp.com, he was released because he was, quote, suffering from acute emotional disturbance, disorganized thinking, uncontrollable crying, and rage, end quote. This is a day and a half after this experiment started. So when he went to speak to Zimbardo, who, remember, was acting as the warden, he was told that he was weak and given the offer to become an informant in exchange for no more harassment.
What the hell? That is tampering with the experiment. No, like, dude, you're sabotaging the whole thing.
Absolutely. So this guy, this prisoner 8612, then goes and tells the other prisoners, you can't leave. You can't quit. That's a direct quote. You can't leave. You can't quit. And that solidified their sense of really being imprisoned here. Eventually, 8612 was released because the researchers clearly saw that he was mentally suffering. But again, this goes beyond just putting them in the physical walls of this makeshift prison. Mentally, they actually felt as though they were in a prison and could not escape. Prisoner number 416, who is one of the 6 who were chosen as alternates should a guard or a prisoner not be able to complete the study, was brought in and immediately began to stir up trouble. He went on a hunger strike to try and get himself released. And when the guards tried to get him to eat, he, just wouldn't. They eventually threw him into solitary confinement for 3 hours, even though their own rules stated that 1 hour was the limit. So this guy's not eating. They throw him into solitary for 3 hours, even though they were told 1 hour is the limit. You can't have anybody in that closet for more than an hour.
Dude, that's so messed up. That's terrible.
The rest of the prisoners saw him as a troublemaker that would only make things worse for them. And so when they were given the choice to either leave him in there or get him out by exchanging their blankets for his release, they ended up keeping him in there all night long. The prisoners were forced to do menial tasks throughout the experiment, such as cleaning out toilet bowls with their bare hands, which
That's
gross.
disgusting. Ew.
Ugh. They had to do push-ups and jumping jacks and stand during daily counts for several hours at a time. This would go on for the remainder of the experiment, which thankfully only ended up lasting 6 of the 14 days it was scheduled for.
Okay, that's still 6 days too long.
Absolutely. According to Zimbardo, quote, at this point it became clear that we had to end the study. We had created an overwhelmingly powerful situation, a situation in which prisoners were withdrawing and behaving in pathological ways, and in which some of the guards were behaving sadistically. Even the, quote, good guards felt helpless to intervene, and none of the guards quit while the study was in progress, end quote. Therefore, after 6 days, the experiment was ended.
I don't want to even know the psychological trouble that not the guards, but the prisoners went through for all of this.
The conclusion of the experiment was said to be that people will conform to the social roles that they are expected to play. It said that the environment makes the person behave in unspeakable ways, not their natural predisposition to do so. However, this is not entirely true. There are more events that occurred during those 6 days, but I do want to shift into kind of describing all of the ways that the Stanford Prison Experiment was not quite psychologically sound.
That's the thing. Why are we still talking about this in psychology classes and not talking about how this was a complete train wreck and total disaster? This is what you should never do.
I think it's a great example of, hey, this is a train wreck and a disaster, and this is what you should never do. But I don't know why it's still being taught as something that is fine and still regarded as, an upstanding psychological experiment.
Yeah, because it's clearly not one.
Absolutely not. The first and probably most damning criticism is that the guards were acting the way that they were because of what are called, quote, demand characteristics, end quote. According to an article on verywellmind.com, quote, in a psychological experiment, a demand characteristic is a subtle cue that makes participants aware of what the experimenter expects to find or how the participants are expected to behave. Demand characteristics can change the outcome of an experiment because participants will often alter their behavior to conform to expectations, end quote.
So basically, they're implanting the idea in their head before they've even begun.
Right. So the people who are being experimented on have an idea of what they're being tested for. And so they won't act in the way that they would naturally act. They'll either consciously or subconsciously change their behavior in order to give the scientist the results that they want. Dave Eshelman, who is often considered the experiment's most intimidating, cruel, and overall infamous guard, said that the guards were led to believe that they were not a part of the experiment. This is a good thing, scientifically speaking, but the next thing he said immediately invalidated literally the entire experiment. He said in an interview, quote, "We were led to believe that our job was to get results from the prisoners, that they're the ones the researchers are really studying. If they want to show that prison is a bad experience, I'm going to make it bad," end quote.
Wait. So they implanted that idea. Like the whole thing. Why are we still talking about this?
I have no idea. It's ridiculous.
We should talk about how bad it is in a train wreck, but we should not. They were basically telling the guards, "Oh yeah, get something out of them, treat them badly."
Right. And I mean, like I said, making it so that the guards don't think that they're actually a part of the experiment is, fine. But you can't then be dictating their behavior. After the experiment concluded, many of the guards claimed that they were simply acting and would not behave in such an extreme way in real life. A simplypsychology.org article stated, quote, "Because the guards and prisoners were playing a role, their behavior may not be influenced by the same factors which affect behavior in real life. This means the study's findings cannot be reasonably generalized to real life, such as prison settings, i.e., the study has low ecological validity," end quote. So obviously, the study has received a lot of ethical criticisms as well. This includes lack of fully informed consent by the participants because Zimbardo himself did not know what would happen in the experiment. So basically, it was unpredictable.
That is scary and not good.
Again, it goes back to if you're going to be conducting an experiment using people, there are so many other ways to get the results that you want without putting them through such horrifically traumatizing experiences such as this. So that brings us to the end of analyzing the Stanford Prison Experiment. There are so many fantastic documentaries about this, so many good articles. I highly recommend everybody go and do a little bit of research on your own for it. I think it's fascinating. And yeah, it should not have any sort of psychological influence at all. And yet, for some reason, I learned about it in college as like an actual valid experiment. Thank you all for listening to A Criminally Basic Podcast. If you'd like to learn more, check us out at A Criminally Basic Podcast on Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.
And check out our sources as well as photos on our website, www.acriminallybasicpodcast.podbean.com.
Thank you for listening.